Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to basically be addressing a number of frequently asked questions about two topics in religious epistemology. The first half will be dedicated to Pascal's wager, and the second half will be dedicated to faith. So let's start off by just reviewing a little bit about what Pascal's wager is. Pascal's wager is a pragmatic argument for belief in God. So the argument goes something like this, at least in its most simplistic form. The idea is that if God exists and you believe in God, that would be infinitely good because you get to have a relationship with God and go to heaven. If God exists and you don't believe in God, you might initially think that would be infinitely bad if you go to hell. We're actually going to talk in a second about why you don't have to think there's a hell in order to get Pascal's wager going. But we'll just leave it like that for now. And then if God doesn't exist, whether you believe in God or not, the outcome's going to be finite either way. So there could be serious costs to believing in God or converting to a religion. The idea is that just if there's no God, those costs are going to be finite. So because we have this infinitely good outcome, if God exists and you believe in God, that seems to kind of trump these other possibilities. So given the cost-benefit analysis, you should believe in God. Three of the biggest objections to Pascal's wager are what's follows. The first is the many gods objection. Which religion should we wager on? Especially pertinent because some religions don't teach that all you have to do to believe in God, to go to heaven is to believe in God. You may have to practice their religion in particular. So because religions are what's called mutually exclusive, meaning you have to pick between them in order to get the benefits, it seems like a really big problem, a really big question, what religion we should wager on. The second is the impossibility objection, which says taking Pascal's wager is impossible because we don't have control over our beliefs. And then the third objection is the irrationality objection. So even if we could figure out a way to take Pascal's wager, taking Pascal's wager would be irrational because we should base our beliefs on evidence, not whether a belief has certain benefits. So this video is actually going to presuppose my other video on Pascal's wager where I give responses to each of these objections, and these are answering questions that have been raised in response to that video. So I'll link that initial video in the description for your reference. Okay, so first question a couple people raised. Part of what Pascal's wager brings out is that there's two different ways you can argue for theism. Two different kinds of arguments for God's existence. The first is the epistemic approach. What the epistemic approach does is it aims to determine the probability that God exists. So you can have this be, raising, or you could have it be lowering the probability of God's existence. The pragmatic approach then says, well, what's the cost-benefit analysis like? Should we believe in God? So it's not necessarily saying what's the probability of God's existence and using that to determine whether we should believe in God, but it's looking at the costs and benefits associated with believing in God and not believing in God. So one initial question is, what is involved in, if we want to take an epistemic approach to theism, what does that look like? So when we're looking at the probability of the question, does God exist? I think there's very interesting considerations on both sides of things. We have a number of arguments for God's existence. One example is the first cause argument, which goes like this. There's a first cause. If there's a first cause, then God exists because God is that first cause. So God exists. Another argument is the fine-tuning argument. Basically says, look, the universe is finely tuned for life. There's certain quantities, constants, these laws of nature that if they were slightly higher or slightly lower, we wouldn't have a universe that permits life. And if the universe is finely tuned for life, then God exists. God's existence is the best explanation for why our laws of nature are at these precise values that permit life. Again, if they were slightly higher or slightly lower, our universe wouldn't have life. And so the idea is that God designed it that way. God designed our universe, so there would be life. So the conclusion is that God exists. Other arguments here include the ontological argument, which basically argues that God exists from the concept of God. design arguments, moral arguments, and even the evolutionary argument against naturalism, which even if it's more creating a problem for views that don't involve God, but it again purports to in some way raise the probability that God exists. On the other hand, though, we have arguments against God's existence. So there's two big ones. The first is the problem of evil. Problem of evil says, look, if God's all good and all powerful, then there wouldn't be pointless evil, because if God is good, then God would want to prevent pointless evil. And if God is powerful, then God could prevent pointless evil. But there is pointless evil. At least it seems like there is. There's a lot of really bad things that happen, and it's not clear that those things have a point. And because of this, it seems like an all good, all powerful God does not exist. At least this is evidence against that kind of God. A second argument against God's existence is the problem of divine hiddenness, which goes like this. If God's all good and all powerful, then people wouldn't blamelessly fail to believe in God. This is because an all good, all powerful God would be open to relationship with all. In virtue of being all good, God would be open to relationship with everybody, would want a relationship with all of God's creatures. But in virtue of being all powerful, God would be able to ensure that the path to that relationship was open, unless someone purposely blocked themselves off from God in a way that they're blameworthy for. And the idea is that some people do blamelessly fail to believe in God. Maybe this isn't true for everyone who doesn't believe in God, but at least some of these people aren't blameworthy for the fact that they don't believe in God. And because of this, the argument concludes that there's not an all good, all powerful God. So these are just two of the arguments against God's existence. Some other arguments is that people try to argue that the concept of theism itself is in some way incoherent. Maybe the attributes of God, like God being all good, all powerful, all knowing, and present everywhere, maybe they conflict with each other, or maybe they like one attribute itself just doesn't make sense. So that's another way to argue against God's existence. And you might also just appeal to simplicity. You might say, if we have two theories that have roughly equal explanatory power, the one without God is in some ways simpler. So we should prefer the theory that doesn't have God in the picture. Of course, would have to establish that they have equal explanatory power, which I'm sure some theists would deny. But that's kind of another way you could argue against God's existence. So these sort of considerations for and against, obviously this is not even close to any kind of exhaustive list, but hopefully gives you some idea of what's involved in this epistemic approach to God, and how we might evaluate the question, what is the probability that God exists? Okay, so we talked about Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is not an epistemic approach to theism, but it's a practical approach to theism. And it basically says, like I said before, there's benefits to being a theist that aren't available for the non-theist. And you might wonder, does this conflict with evidentialism, this idea that we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence? And if we think that Pascal's wager is an argument that tells us what we ought to believe, then there is a sense in which it does conflict with evidentialism, because it denies that what we should believe is determined only by our evidence. Practical factors like the benefits of belief do play into what one should believe. However, I think even if we stick to the belief version of the wager, there's another sense in which Pascal's wager doesn't conflict with evidentialism. And this begins with the idea that sometimes our evidence is just complicated. It's difficult to assess. And based on some of the reasons that we just talked about, one might think that the evidence for theism is like this. There's arguments for and against. It's complicated. There's multiple competing explanations of things. And in cases where evidence is like this, it does seem like people can disagree and be rational. So you might think that theists and atheists and agnostics, they can all be rational, even if they are aware of the same body of evidence about God's existence. This is what a view called epistemic permissivism says. So in this sense, if you buy this permissivist picture, Pascal's wager actually doesn't conflict with the idea that we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence, because multiple attitudes are equally well supported by the evidence. Because of this, we can proportion our beliefs to the evidence, but still take Pascal's wager. especially if theism would need to be one of the attitudes that's epistemically permitted for us. But we can be a theist and still proportion our beliefs to the evidence because our evidence allows more than one rational response. And then, of course, we don't have to make Pascal's wager about what you should believe. Some people make Pascal's wager about making a commitment to God. Maybe we should go to church, read scripture, pray, and be a part of a religious community. Maybe that's the conclusion of Pascal's wager. And if all Pascal's wager is about is actions, then it's not going to conflict with evidentialism, because evidentialism is about what we should believe. Okay. A big question that a lot of people ask is the question of hell. And specifically, what if I don't believe in hell? What if I think it's really implausible that an all good, all loving God would send people to hell? I think this is a really important question. And I guess the first thing I'll say is a lot of people may not be aware that there are philosophically sophisticated defenses of hell. I'm not here to try to defend hell by any means, but just want to note that it is something philosophers have thought about and given arguments for, at least trying to make sense of how could a loving God justly send people to hell. So I'll just, with that caveat and, putting that aside for now, I want to note, pretty important, Pascal's wager does not require one to believe in hell. So there's a couple options here. One is that maybe some people cease to exist at death and others go to heaven. This is a view called annihilationism. No one goes to hell. Some people cease to exist when they die, others go to heaven. This is enough for Pascal's wager to go through, so you don't have to believe in hell at all. You can just think that some people stop existing when they die. Also note that because Pascal's wager has infinities in the mix, infinities are really powerful, and because of the power of infinities, unless you're 100% certain that there's no hell and there's no annihilationism, you can still get the wager going. So you have to be sure that there's no chance that there's a hell and there's no chance that that annihilationism is true. And on most views of what we should be certain of, those aren't the kinds of things we should be certain of. Maybe you should be certain that 1 + 1 = 2, or certain that there can't be true contradictions, but to be certain that there's no hell and that people are never annihilated seems questionable. So unless you're 100% sure of these things, you can still get the wager going. But let's just say you are 100% certain everyone goes to heaven. So you're sure that this view called universalism is true, the view that everyone goes to heaven. Even on this view, there's at least 2 ways that you can make Pascal's wager work. So the first is that there's different levels of heaven. Some people have a really good heaven. It's great. Heaven's awesome. But some people have an even better heaven. If there's these different levels of heaven, and especially if some are infinitely better than others, then you can make Pascal's wager work. Another way that maybe is a little bit more unconventional is actually a version of the wager that doesn't even talk about the afterlife at all, but instead just focuses on our current earthly pre-mortem existence. And on this version of the wager, if you think that theists are happier or healthier or better off in some way than atheists are in this life, which I will note some studies suggest this. There's actually a nice paper by Justin McBrayer I can link in the description that gives some of the empirical data on this, but some of the data shows like theists are happier, healthier, less likely to get divorced, contribute more to charity, some various things. So if you buy that and you're roughly 50-50 on theism and atheism, even if you think everyone goes to heaven and universalism is true and there's no levels of heaven, you can actually still get Pascal's wager off the ground, because for this life, it's better for you to be a theist than to be an atheist. So there's a lot of different ways to make Pascal's wager work, even if you don't believe that there's a hell. And I actually have a whole video where I go into this in more detail. So check that video out if you want to learn more about this question. Okay. Here's another question about Pascal's wager. Does taking Pascal's wager involve bad motives? I actually get this question a lot, especially from theists or Christians. So it depends is the answer. And of course, you can take Pascal's wager and have bad motives. It would be way too strong to say that it's impossible to take Pascal's wager with bad motives. However, I think there are ways to take Pascal's wager with good motives. So consider Peter. Let's say Peter has very serious doubts about God's existence. Peter would not say that he is someone that believes in God, for example. Peter may nonetheless reason in the following way. If God exists and I commit to God, that would be a very good thing. So look, if God exists, God's this powerful good being who created the whole universe. This is someone who I would want to pursue, someone I would want to commit my life to. So even the possibility that God exists gives me a strong reason to pursue a relationship with God, because knowing a being like that would be incredibly valuable. So this kind of line of thinking, I think, represents good motives. It's the motive of wanting to know an all-powerful, all-good creator. But notice that Peter is reasoning in this way while having very serious doubts about God's existence. So Peter's not motivated by some kind of epistemic approach. Peter's not saying, here's a bunch of arguments for God's existence, so I need to believe in God. This is definitely a pragmatic approach to God's existence, but I think it nonetheless shows good motives. So even if it's possible to take Pascal's wager with bad motives, it's also possible to take Pascal's wager with good motives. And I expand on all of this in a lot more detail in my paper, Faithfully Taking Pascal's Wager. And I also have a video where I give that paper as well. I can link the video and the paper in the description. Okay. How could it be rational to commit to God if one doesn't believe in God? I think this is a really good question. Part of the reason this comes up is because some people say, well, there's a bunch of objections for making Pascal's wager something about belief. Maybe, again, we can't control our beliefs in the right way. Maybe this conflicts with evidentialism. I'm actually not convinced either of those objections are totally the final word on the matter. I think there's good responses that the person can give. But let's say we want to set aside the wager that makes it about belief and instead focus on questions about commitment. So if we want to make the wager about whether one should commit to God, one might say, look, if I'm I have tons of doubts about God's existence and I by no means believe in God, how could committing to God be rational? That just seems silly. So here's two examples that I think at least show why I think that belief and action can come apart. It can be rational to believe something, even if it's not rational for you to act on that belief. And it can also be rational for you to act on something, even if you don't believe it. Here's the cases. So this is a case where we believe something, but we shouldn't act on it. And this is a case where, let's say you live by a really thick lake. And sorry, not a thick lake, but a lake with thick ice. And let's say you live really far north, it's the middle of winter, the lake is frozen over and the ice is maybe several feet deep. So it's very, very cold and you definitely believe the lake is frozen over and if you walk on it, you're not going to fall through. So you do believe that. However, there's a chance you're wrong about that. There's a chance it's been a little warmer than it usually is this time of year. You're not positive. You're not 100% certain that the lake is safe to walk on, but you do believe it. You have pretty good evidence for it. Let's say your kids want to go play on the frozen lake, right? Does not seem like a good idea to say, yes, go play on the frozen lake, no problem. No, that's way too risky. So even if you believe that the ice is solid, that doesn't mean you can act on that because there's too big of a risk involved. And because we're not always 100% certain in everything that we believe, sometimes we can believe something and believe it rationally. We have good evidence for it. But because we're not certain, it's not worth the risk. Don't let your kids go play on the frozen ice, even if you believe it's solid, because what if they did fall through? That would be horrible. Okay, so that's belief without action. Now let's think about a case of action without belief. So this is a case where you don't believe something, but it's still rational for you to act on it. Let's say your brother goes missing. And let's say when he initially goes missing, you think there's a pretty good chance he's alive, but search parties have been going for several weeks. Maybe you hire a private detective to try to find him and you're just not finding him. You don't know where he is. Time is passing and your confidence level that your brother is alive goes from high to low to low to low to low. Maybe it even goes below 0.5. You do not believe your brother is still alive anymore because you have too much counter evidence. If he was still alive, there's a good chance he would have been found by now. However, I think it can still be rational in this case to act as if your brother is still alive, continue to search for him, put up missing posters, ask around, try to figure out what happened to him, even if your confidence that he's alive is below 0.5. And that's because it would be so good to find him if he was still alive. And so the risk reward trade-off is worth it. If you come to the point where you think, your brother's body is found or something, so your credence that your brother is alive is 0 or almost 0 or whatever, then that's a case where maybe you should give it up. You shouldn't keep acting on it. But you could have a pretty low credence that your brother's alive, and it could still be rational for you to continue to search for him. Okay. So Pascal's wager might fall into the second category. Might be a case where you have a lot to gain if something's true and a little to lose if it's false. And so it's okay to act on it, even if you don't believe it. Okay. One question I get a lot. So in response to the many gods objection, which says there's a bunch of different religions, which one should you practice? The best response to that says that at least all else equal, you should practice the religion that is most likely to be true. And a lot of people ask, how do you determine which religion is most likely to be true? Like, how do you figure that out? Here's the answer. And it's a simple answer, but I think it's the right one: by looking at the arguments and evidence. There's different arguments that different religions give for the truth of their religion. And so what you need to do is look at those and weigh those and use that to determine which one's most likely. So for example, there's a resurrection argument for Christianity, which basically says, given certain historical facts, the best explanation is that Jesus did rise from the dead. There's also some fulfilled prophecy arguments for Islam. So there was prophecy about the rate at which Islam would spread in certain regions, and those prophecies were fulfilled. So that would, be evidence for Islam. And so what you do is you look at these various arguments, you weigh them against each other, and use those to determine which religion is most likely to be true. Okay. I'm going to stop there for now, and then I'll do part 2, which is answering people's questions about faith.